What would happen if the most arrogant bully in school targeted the wrong person? A quiet black girl with a secret, powerful enough to shake his entire world. This is the story of Maya Williams, a new black student who is looked down upon simply because of her skin color and quiet demeanor. But Bryce Carter has no idea that she is the biological daughter of the governor of Texas, and she doesn't need to shout to fight back. She lets the truth speak for itself. By the end, what starts with prejudice and arrogance will end in an irreversible downfall. Maya Williams, 16 years old, with a slender frame, dark brown skin, and a thoughtful gaze, faces yet another unfamiliar place. This is the fourth school in 3 years. For an average student, that might be a concerning number. But for Maya, starting over in a new environment has become all too familiar, as if she was programmed to live among the scrutinizing stares and whispered gossip behind her back. Of course, none of the students gathered outside, laughing and chatting or shrugging their shoulders while wearing headphones, knew that the girl who just stepped off the bus was the daughter of the governor of Texas, Franklin Williams, the first black man to hold that office in the state's history. A name that made headlines, sparked political debates every time he spoke. But Maya had never used that as a ticket to get ahead. Instead, she kept her connection to her father a secret. No one knew, and she didn't want anyone to know. She understood the cost of fame. Being the governor's daughter meant being met with either fearful or envious stares, compliments mixed with suspicion, and fake relationships surrounding her. She had been through all of it. Prestigious schools, wealthy and scheming classmates, teachers trying to get close to please her father. And when Maya didn't respond, they called her haughty, cold, unapproachable. She was tired of it. So this time she chose anonymity. No private car, no bodyguards, no welcome party, and not a single mention of her father in her student records. Maya was just Maya, an ordinary transfer student, nothing special. She wore a gray hoodie, dark jeans, and carried an old backpack. Everything was calculated to avoid attention. She walked through the school gate, leaving behind the laughter and the heavy name she carried. Williams. Inside the hallway, the blue lockers stretched along the walls, the sound of sneakers echoing on the tiled floor. And somewhere in the mix was the smell of cheap perfume, mingled with paper and books. Maya wasn't unfamiliar with this scene. All schools are the same when you're an outsider. In her hand, she held a class schedule printed from the office. She glanced through it, then nodded slightly. First step: find the locker, find the classrooms, and most importantly, stay away from those who could cause trouble. Maya tightened the straps of her backpack. Once again, she was ready to play the familiar game, blend in, observe, and survive in the harsh world of high school. But this time, she had no idea there would be no place to hide. And the first person to find her wasn't a friend, but the most dangerous bully in the school. And then, as if fate refused to let her be at peace for even a single day, Maya had just passed the first row of lockers when a sudden force from the left made her stop. All the books and her schedule in her hands fell to the floor, scattering like disjointed pieces of a new day full of chaos. The sound of the book covers hitting the floor echoed through the crowded hallway, causing a few students to turn around, only to either burst into laughter or smile quietly. No one stepped forward to help. Maya gently bent down, picking up each book with an unsettling calmness. But her hands tightened, and for a moment she looked up. Her gaze meeting a pair of shiny white sneakers, followed by Nike athletic pants, and finally a dangerously handsome face, looking down at her with a gaze that was half amused, half disdainful. Bryce Carter. No introduction needed, Maya immediately knew who he was, the type of person found in any school. Popular, handsome, overly confident, and full of arrogance. But at Clearview High, Bryce wasn't just another standout student. He was a living legend of school power. captain of the football team, son of a well-known real estate mogul, growing up in a mansion, driving a sports car to school since 10th grade, Bryce had it all, both fame and influence. And he knew it. That confidence wasn't in a dazzling smile like a movie star on a magazine cover, but in his eyes, the kind of look that comes from someone used to making others shrink back with just a glance. Bryce liked to dominate. He liked to control. He liked the feeling of knowing others were afraid of him. And above all, he liked vulnerable targets, new, quiet, different students. Maya, with her reserved demeanor, her evasive eyes, no friends, was the perfect prey. "Oh, sorry," Bryce spoke up, his tone utterly insincere. He tilted his head, hands in his jacket pockets, his gaze sweeping over Maya as if she were some strange creature that had just fallen out of nowhere. "Didn't expect a new student introduction today. Maybe you should learn how to watch where you're going, or stay out of territories you don't understand." Bryce's friends behind him snickered softly, not loudly, but enough to create an invisible pressure around Maya. In that moment, the space seemed to shrink. The hallway felt narrower, the light dimmer, and the mocking laughter echoed like a whip cracking against her self-esteem. Maya stood up, brushing the hem of her hoodie, picked up the last notebook, and looked directly at Bryce. No words, no frown, no shout. Just her eyes, cold, deep, and dangerously silent, like a still lake before the storm. Bryce faltered for a moment. Maybe he hadn't expected a new student to not panic like all the other victims. There was something in her gaze that made his smile waver. A little less perfect, almost defensive. Maya didn't react. She slipped past him, walking steadily as if no one had bumped into her, as if she hadn't been mocked in a crowded hallway. It was that silence, the way she left him without a single response, that made Bryce the most uncomfortable. He turned his head, calling out in a half-joking, half-threatening tone, "Hey, I asked you. At least say thank you, right? Are you mute or something?" Maya stopped, turned her head, her eyes still calm, but her voice low and cold. "You shouldn't do that." That was all. No raised voice, no threats. But Bryce stood still, his eyes narrowing. A new student, black, quiet, daring to speak to him like that. He laughed, an empty, challenging laugh. "So what, princess, you going to report me to the principal? Or have your mom come pick you up?" Maya didn't answer, but the faint smile that touched the corner of her lips seemed to suggest she knew something that Bryce couldn't possibly anticipate. No one knew that, just a few hours later, this arrogant boy would stand frozen as he watched her step into the SUV of the state governor, a man who held the power to determine the political future of Bryce's entire family. And that was just the beginning. Bryce Carter had never thought that a new student could occupy his mind so much. But throughout that class, he was constantly haunted by the gaze of a girl named Maya Williams. A quiet, calm look, so unnervingly still. Bryce was too used to the other kind of gaze. Admiration, hesitation, longing, or even fear from the other students when facing him. He was the unquestionable star of Clearview High, the captain of the football team, the son of a real estate mogul, with his own sports car and preferential treatment from teachers in both sports and academic competitions. To Bryce, new students were just temporary toys. The shy ones, the awkward ones, or those too different, they were all ideal targets to help reinforce his reputation. And Maya, with her silent demeanor, walking through the crowd as if she left no trace, was clearly a perfect case. But the way she walked without looking back, how she stared directly into his eyes and then turned away without hesitation, as if she had read all the games he'd ever played, that made him uneasy. That afternoon, when the bell rang for school to end, Bryce stood near the school gates, where students were streaming out, cars waiting by the curb. He leaned against a lamppost, hands stuffed in his sports jacket pockets, eyes scanning the crowd until he spotted the familiar figure. Maya, slowly walking out, her backpack slung over one shoulder, earphones casually hanging around her neck. He didn't say anything immediately. He just watched. Then he smirked and stepped in front of her. "Hey, new kid," Bryce said loudly, deliberately raising his voice enough for a few nearby students to glance over. "What's with you? You didn't even say hello to anyone all day?" Maya stopped, her eyes glued to her phone, then looked up at him with an expressionless gaze. No anger, no fear, no awkwardness, just a simple, silent look, unnervingly calm. Bryce waited for a reaction, an apology, some nervousness, or at least a response. But nothing. Maya didn't say anything. She just stared at him as though she was calculating how much energy to expend responding to something so meaningless. "Oh, so you're playing the cold act, huh?" Bryce chuckled, but the sound was a little forced. "You think you're special, don't you? You look like one of those girls who wants attention but doesn't have enough personality to pull it off." Maya slightly tilted her head, the corner of her mouth lifting ever so slightly. Not quite a smile, just a vague sign of understanding. Then she slipped her hand into her jacket pocket, pulled out her phone, tapped something on the screen and put it back. Bryce raised an eyebrow, smirking. "Calling for backup? You scared now? Or calling your mom to pick you up?" He stepped closer, now just an arm's length away. "Well, new kid, if you're going to try to scare anyone around here, you're going to have to try harder. This isn't a playground." Just as his words ended, a deep, steady rumble began from a distance, a growl-like sound, like wind sweeping over steel, growing closer by the second. The students around started to turn their heads toward the noise, including Bryce. And then, like a shadow coming from the heart of the city, a matte, black-armored SUV slowly rolled up, cutting through the crowd and cars at the school gates. The car had no regular license plate. On the front, two small flags crossed over the hood. One American flag, one Texas state flag. The headlights didn't blink, but they shone with the kind of presence that didn't need permission to be noticed. The vehicle stopped smoothly, without a sound, as if the ground had grown accustomed to obeying it. The door swung open. The man who stepped out made the air around him feel still, tall, in a perfectly tailored gray suit, his neatly combed graying hair, eyes focused straight ahead, each step exuding the confidence of someone who had long been accustomed to standing in rooms where budgets, lives, and laws were decided. It was none other than Franklin Williams, the current governor of Texas. Bryce stood frozen, his mouth slightly opened as if to say something, but every word seemed to lose its meaning. He knew this face. Who didn't? Newspapers, television, press conferences, campaign speeches, viral social media videos. But what truly left him speechless was not the governor's presence, but the way he looked at Maya, not like a politician, but with the eyes of a father full of love and protection. Maya said nothing. She walked past Bryce, not sparing him a glance, heading toward the waiting SUV. But just before getting into the car, she stopped, turned, and looked at him. Her gaze no longer indifferent. It carried something both sharp and calm, both pointed and forgiving. Her voice rang out quiet and clear, like an arrow piercing Bryce's heart. "You asked who I think I am? Wrong question. The right one is, who do you really think you are to mess with me?" Bryce couldn't say a word. His friends behind him, the ones who would usually laugh along whenever he threw out a taunt, stood silent. The students around began murmuring, phones out, snapping pictures, recording clips, capturing the moment they knew would spread across the school within hours. Maya got into the car, the door shut. The SUV rolled away slowly, then sped up, disappearing around the distant corner. No horn, no noise, no need for another word. It was enough. Bryce stood still, motionless, his fists clenched. He felt a chill down his spine, not from fear, but for the first time in his life he realized he wasn't the biggest presence in the room. And worse, he didn't know what to do with that feeling. The next morning, Bryce woke up earlier than usual. But it wasn't because of the enthusiasm for a workout or excitement for a new school day. It was because of the heavy feeling pressing on his chest all night like a cold stone. His sleep was restless, fragmented, filled with broken pieces of memory. Maya's gaze before she stepped into the SUV with the state flag. A look so cold it chilled him to the bone, but sharp enough to be a declaration of war without a single shot fired. Bryce had tried to brush it off, telling himself it was just luck, that she was merely sheltered by power and had nothing special about her. But when he looked at himself in the mirror, clad in his neat football uniform, his hair perfectly styled with gel, he understood what made him angry wasn't just her status. It was the feeling of losing before he even started. As Bryce walked through the school gate that morning, he immediately sensed the atmosphere had changed. It wasn't obvious, it wasn't loud, but something different was hanging in the hallways. The groups of students who usually gathered to discuss the same old topics, game results, weekend gossip, or the new chemistry teacher, were now whispering about Maya Williams. No one said her name directly, but words like armored car, state flag, and is he her dad popped up enough for Bryce to know the news had spread throughout the school. And then he saw her. Maya was walking from the B building to the main classroom block, her backpack slung over one shoulder, still in the same gray hoodie and old faded black shoes. She wore no makeup, didn't smile, didn't try to impress anyone. But strangely, this was what made her stand out more than anyone else. The stares directed at her were no longer the suspicious ones Bryce had grown used to. No one was sneaking snickers behind her back anymore. Instead, there was a sense of curiosity mixed with respect. They whispered because they admired her, not out of pity. And that was something Bryce couldn't bear. Maya passed by him as if he were invisible. He stood by his locker, his usual crowd of friends still around him, but this time, none of them made a single mocking remark. Not because they were scared, but because they were just as confused. The event from yesterday, though brief, had been enough to shake up the long-established social hierarchy in every student's mind at clear view. Bryce Carter was still the star, but for the first time, his aura was overshadowed by the presence of a new player, a player who didn't need a stage to be in the center of attention. During the first class, Bryce didn't hear a word. He kept glancing over to the other side of the room where Maya was sitting, taking notes steadily. Not once did she look back at him. Not once did she show any sign of triumph. But that was what made him choke. She didn't need to humiliate him. Just existing was enough to put him at a disadvantage, and that was something he couldn't accept. Not Bryce Carter, not in this place. When the bell rang for break, he stood up immediately, his fingers gripping his notebook so tightly that the veins on the back of his hand stood out. He strode out into the hallway, calling Ryan, his big loyal friend who was always ready to do whatever it took to be seen as faithful, and whispered something in his ear. Ryan didn't react immediately, but eventually nodded, his eyes no longer gleaming with excitement like usual. Lunchtime was when Bryce made his first move. Maya was walking down the middle aisle of the cafeteria with her tray when Ryan, sitting next to Bryce's table, accidentally stuck his foot out. The trip wasn't too harsh, but it was enough to make Maya lose her balance, almost tipping her tray. A can of soda fell, rolling around under the feet of other students. A few people chuckled, not loudly, not with glee, but with a hesitant, almost apologetic laugh. Maya stood up straight, her tray tilted, but her eyes never wavered. She looked at Ryan, then Bryce, her gaze slow, as if she were watching two actors in a play she had already read the script for. Then, after a deep breath, she spoke, her voice soft as mist, but loud enough for those nearby to hear. "I didn't think there were still people here who hadn't evolved." Her words hit the air like a hammer, breaking the tense silence. The whole table went still for a few seconds, then a quiet giggle erupted from one corner. A girl covered her mouth in laughter, followed by a few others. No one dared laugh loudly, but the uncontrollable giggles made Bryce feel more uncomfortable than a round of applause in his face. Ryan bowed his head, his face bright red, while Bryce clenched his fist so tightly his nails dug into his palm. Maya didn't stop. She continued to her table in the far corner, setting her tray down, opening her milk carton, eating as if nothing had happened. Bryce sat still. Inside him was no longer just anger, but an underground storm, a chaos he had never known how to handle. Maya didn't react with fear, no screaming, no cursing, no calling for help. She just used words, glances, and silence like a sharp knife, cutting away pieces of his power little by little. After lunch, Bryce quickly walked out into the hallway, kicking a soda can underfoot. It wasn't because he was angry at Maya, it was because he was angry at himself. He had let her take the lead, and he swore this wouldn't be the end. This was just the beginning. The can of soda flew far and rolled in circles under the feet of the passing students. But Bryce didn't bother to chase after it or look back. He strode down the hallway, his feet pounding the tile floor as if trying to shake the chaotic thoughts from his head. The anger was boiling beneath his skin. No longer just about Maya, but the humiliation of realizing his old tricks no longer worked. She wasn't hurt, she wasn't crying, she wasn't panicking. She didn't cry out for help, she didn't even give a pitying look. She just stood there, calm and proud, as if all his dirty tricks were nothing more than a cheap act in a schoolyard circus. Bryce's friends still followed him, but the silence between them made Bryce feel more alone than ever. In the past, when he showed his anger, they would laugh, fueling his rage with cruel jokes or suggestions for ways to teach the victim a lesson. But today, the air around him was stifling, awkward. No one dared to say that Maya deserved it. No one dared to be sure that if things went too far, the consequences would be worse. Though no one said it aloud, they all knew. This girl wasn't like the ones who had crumbled under Bryce's hand. She was the daughter of one of the most powerful people in the state, and that made it even harder for Bryce to bear. He couldn't let himself be overshadowed. He couldn't let the students in the school think that he'd lost. A guy like Bryce Carter was never supposed to back down. That's what his father always taught him. In the world of leaders, there's no place for weakness or passivity. You have to control everything, make others fear you, because once that fear is gone, power slips away faster than a fall. The next day, the game officially began. Maya walked into school as usual, her deep eyes revealing no emotion, moving slowly as if she didn't belong here but didn't need to hide from it either. But when she approached her locker, the first thing that hit her was the overpowering smell of ink, and soon after, the familiar sight of hostility. The metal locker was defaced with red spray paint, streaked with crude, offensive, and clearly racist words. Her books had been thrown out of the locker, scattered across the floor, some pages torn, others soaked from a bottle of water someone had intentionally dumped on them. A group of students stood nearby. No one laughed, no one spoke, but all of them watched. The silent gaze of people waiting for something to happen, A reaction, an outburst, a scream. Because this was the familiar script. Time and time again, a victim, after being publicly humiliated, would break down, cry, shout accusations, or run away. And then everything would go back to normal. Except the bully would only grow stronger. But Maya didn't do any of that. She just stood still for a few seconds, quietly observing the scene before her, as if she were looking at a child's scribbled picture. Then she bent down, picked up each book, gently brushed off the dust, and neatly stacked them. No sighs, no searching eyes for help. When she reached the last book, she stood up, gently turned, leaned against the locker, and started wiping the red writing off with a piece of tissue. Her movements were steady, rhythmic, and not a bit shaky. Bryce stood at the end of the hallway, watching the whole thing unfold. He had been waiting for a breakdown, some kind of negative reaction, but what he got instead was a silence that made him choke. Maya wasn't just refusing to play by his rules, she was rewriting the game. A game where the person who keeps their composure is the one who wins, not the one who screams the loudest. On his way to the cafeteria, Bryce gritted his teeth. The game wasn't over. He still had cards to play. At lunch that day, Maya walked into the cafeteria, carrying her tray of food as she always did. Students had gathered in groups, murmuring. But when she passed the middle row of tables, a hand suddenly shot out from under a table. Ryan, still performing his usual task. The leg stretched out just in time to make Maya trip slightly. This time, her tray shifted sharply, spilling part of her rice onto the floor, a few drops of sauce splattering on her shirt. The whole cafeteria seemed to hold its breath. Everyone's eyes were on her, waiting to see what would happen next. Maya set her tray on the nearest table, wiped her hands with a napkin, then bent down to pick up the pieces of bread that had fallen. A few people started to chuckle, but the laughter quickly died down when she looked up, her gaze sharp as a cold blade. She stood up, turned to Ryan, and said loud enough for the whole table to hear, "You know what the saddest thing is? It's not that you're acting like a child, it's that you think it bothers me." Ryan sat frozen, not daring to reply. Bryce clenched his fists under the table, his jaw tightening as if about to snap. Maya turned away, not waiting for a response. She walked over to her usual table, opened her milk carton, and started eating as if no one had interrupted her lunch. And at the tables around her, students began to exchange glances. No one spoke loudly, but in their eyes, something had changed. She wasn't the kind of person who could be bullied. That thought spread like an invisible smoke, weaving through every conversation, every surprised glance, every whispered word behind her back. No one saw Maya as the new girl anymore. She didn't need her father to step in. She didn't need anyone to protect her. She did it herself, through her poise, her silence, and by refusing to let anyone define her. Bryce sat still. His eyes burned with hostility, but deep inside, something else had risen. A quiet fear, nameless. Because for the first time, he had met someone who couldn't be broken, and he didn't know how to shatter her. As Maya stepped out of the school gates that afternoon, the sky above Houston was slowly turning to a copper hue of the setting sun. The last rays of sunlight stretched across the sidewalk, glinting off the windows of distant buildings like shattered glass. She wasn't in a hurry. Every step she took was light, steady, and composed, as if everything that had happened that day had left no trace on her silver-gray blazer, nor had it seeped into the depths of her eyes, as still as the winter lake. The familiar black SUV was already waiting. The driver, dressed in a black suit, stood at attention beside the door, but it was Maya who opened it and entered without needing any assistance. Inside, the soft leather upholstery cradled her slender frame, and the hum of the air conditioner was as steady as a breath. Maya leaned her head back against the seat, saying nothing, simply closing her eyes for a few brief seconds. The silence enveloped the luxurious car like a buffer between two worlds, one full of chaotic school life, and the other a world where power and pride were taught like military discipline. As the car turned into the gates of the estate hidden in the oak forest west of the city, Maya opened her eyes, adjusted the strap of her backpack, and got out without needing a reminder. The sky had darkened, leaving only the streetlights and the sound of crickets as her companions on the stone path leading to the large house. The door opened, and the scent of cedar wood mixed with the rich aroma of coffee wafted from the kitchen. The sound of her shoes echoed softly on the wooden floor, each step steady like a heartbeat, unhurried. Her father, Franklin Williams, currently the governor of Texas, stood beside the long dining table, holding a glass of red wine. The warm golden light reflected off his forehead, where the wrinkles formed lines of experience and resolve. He saw his daughter walk in, place the glass on the oak table, and then leaned against the kitchen counter with his arms crossed. No elaborate greetings, no rushed inquiries. He knew his daughter well enough to understand that if she needed to speak, she would. She placed her backpack on a chair, pulled out her phone, and placed it on the table, then sat across from him, resting her hands on the table and tapping her fingers lightly to an invisible rhythm. He asked slowly, his voice deep and calm like the night wind, "Still? That boy?" Maya nodded slightly. "This morning, and in the cafeteria, he hasn't given up. He hasn't changed." Franklin fell silent for a moment, then picked up his wine glass, swirling the dark red liquid as if he were analyzing a complex political decision. "Do you want me to step in?" The question came out light, almost casually, but behind it lay the weight of a position that would make any student, teacher, or principal in the state bow their heads. Just one phone call. If Franklin Williams' name appeared in the principal's inbox, Bryce Carter would be sucked into an unrelenting storm. Suspended, investigated, perhaps even broadcasted in the media. A complete wipeout. A political blow as sharp as a knife. But Maya did not nod. She looked at him, her gaze neither defiant nor hesitant. She simply shook her head, her voice calm but resolute. "No, I want him to ruin his own reputation." Franklin raised an eyebrow. He looked at his daughter as if seeing himself at 20, when he stood in the middle of student debates, winning not with fists or power, but with patience and logic. Then he smiled. Not the usual polite smile seen on television, but a real smile. A smile of a father, of a seasoned man, of someone who understood that his daughter had grown into the person he had hoped for. "That's the move of the real power holder," he said, setting the glass down. "No need to shout, no need to strike. Just wait for the right moment for the opponent to sink deeper into their own mistake." Maya did not reply, but her eyes shone brighter, as if strengthened. She didn't need outside intervention. She didn't need anyone to retaliate for her. She wanted Bryce, with all his arrogance and pride, to drag his own honor through the mud, because the most bitter fall is the one that comes from within. Her father poured more wine, handed her a glass of non-alcoholic fruit juice, and sat down across from her. They sat in silence for a few minutes, the quiet only broken by the steady ticking of the clock. No need for many words, they shared a silent understanding, a kind of bond that didn't need to be expressed with affection, but with mutual respect for each other's strategy. After dinner, Maya returned to her room. The room wasn't large, but it was tidy, bright, and filled with a soft golden light. On her desk were a few political books, a notebook with debate tactics, and a tablet still open to a school news website. She sat down, opened a blank page, and began typing the first lines of her unofficial plan. Not an attack plan, but a plan to observe, to peel back the layers of Bryce Carter's mask. She didn't need to trap him. He would do that himself. People like Bryce, too self-assured, too confident in their invincibility, would eventually reveal their cracks. All it took was waiting. All it took was quietly observing. All it took was letting him continue making the same mistake over and over until his actions suffocated his own reputation. Maya pressed her lips together, writing a few more notes on the edge of the paper. The names of each of Bryce's friends, the rumors about him, the times he had humiliated others. She collected not to attack, but to understand. To understand him to the core, so that when the time came, she wouldn't need to say a word. His fall would happen under the gaze of the entire school. That night, when she turned off the lights, Maya lay down, her hand resting lightly on her chest, feeling her breath steady like the beat of a drum in a victory march that had yet to sound. She wasn't afraid. She wasn't trembling. She was just waiting. And in the quiet of Houston's night, with the trees swaying outside her window, a smile passed over her lips. Bryce Carter had already begun a war he didn't know he had lost from the start. And Maya Williams, the governor's daughter, would not need to strike, because her enemy had never known how to keep himself from stabbing his own pride with the knife of arrogance. The next morning, the golden sunlight filtered through the trees lining the street, casting shimmering shadows on the grounds of Clear View High, as if everything was proceeding as usual. Students gathered in groups, their laughter and chatter echoed through the hallways, the familiar sounds of a Thursday morning that seemed nothing special. But beneath that noisy surface of daily routine, something was quietly shifting. A ripple was beginning to rise, and its epicenter was none other than Bryce Carter. Maya arrived at school like any other day, walking calmly with a cold yet bright gaze, and her appearance unchanged. A gray hoodie, a single-strap backpack, no makeup, no distractions. But now, every step she took drew new glances, no longer the fleeting looks of curiosity, nor the heavy stares of inquisitiveness. Now, the gazes people directed at Maya carried something more, something akin to respect. Bryce didn't have to try to feel it. He saw it clearly, he heard it clearly, and he felt it in every tense nerve. In the past, whenever he walked down the hallway, there would always be an increasing wave of noise, the high fives, the enthusiastic greetings from his friends, the admiring glances from the girls by their lockers. But today, as he passed those same faces, all he got were reluctant nods, quick glances that darted away, and forced smiles that didn't reach their hearts. This change didn't come from a scandal. No one had stepped forward to accuse him. There were no violent clips leaked. No teachers had condemned his actions. Yet, there was something slowly suffocating the dominant position he once held in his grasp, and that something was Maya Williams. She didn't need to do anything. She simply existed. And it was that presence, firm and unwavering, amidst the taunts and teasing, that made Bryce feel lost. Because for the first time in his life, he encountered someone who didn't falter under his weight. She wasn't crushed when he pressed down. She didn't fade when he entered the room. Not only did Maya not collapse, she stood taller, shone brighter, and held herself with more pride, as though the harder he pushed, the more she rose. Whispers in the classroom had started to place his name in the role of the villain. A group of girls in their literature class were gossiping about how Bryce is actually just a coward who likes picking on weaker people. A few players on the football team began to fall silent when he gave orders during practice, hesitation that had never existed before. Even Ryan, once his most loyal shadow, now sat further away than usual, no longer chiming in when Bryce targeted someone for mockery. Bryce felt like he was falling into an endless void. Every reaction he had was met with indifference. Each time he made a snide remark at Maya, the laughter that used to ring like applause now turned into awkward, strained smiles. Once, when he deliberately bumped into Maya in the crowded hallway, the students around didn't cheer like they always did. Instead, a younger student turned to their friend and whispered, "This guy's clearly scared of her." Though the words were quiet, to someone like Bryce, who had been focusing all his attention on Maya, it rang like an alarm bell. And worse, he knew it wasn't wrong. Because he was scared, not the kind of fear people admit to, but the kind of invisible fear when the power he once held suddenly felt fragile, trembling like a guitar string pulled too tight. He feared losing control of the crowd. He feared that his friends no longer followed his every word. He feared that, even though no one said it, everyone was beginning to lean toward Maya, the girl who didn't need a punch to make him feel weak. Another time, in biology class, the teacher casually mentioned the term chain reaction, and Bryce heard a few giggles from the back of the class where Maya sat. She didn't look at him, didn't say anything, but a few students turned their heads, winking at each other. He knew they were talking about him. He knew his decline had started to spread like cracks on the surface of a once strong wall. He struggled. He tried to throw out new jabs, attempted to play dirty to make Maya lose her composure, tried to hint at those whose parents have their backs. But the more he tried, the colder the crowd's response became. And Maya was still Maya, standing firm like a pillar in the middle of the schoolyard, unshaken, unmoved, never needing to fight but still making her enemies step back. It was in that state that Bryce began to realize something he had never faced before. He was never truly strong. He just had a loud voice, a cheering crowd, and the fear people had of him from his threats and status. But when the crowd's gaze shifted, when the laughter no longer belonged to him, when his confidence was challenged by someone who didn't need words to overpower him, then the so-called power he had was nothing but an illusion. And that illusion was now crumbling, piece by piece. Maya didn't need to do anything more. She just needed to keep being herself, and let Bryce continue to reveal his true nature. Because when one realizes that the king standing on his throne no longer has anyone bowing to him, then that throne has no reason to exist. And Bryce Carter, once the name that everyone feared, was slowly becoming a faint shadow in the crowd. A person in a panic, clutching a hollow throne, with no one left to guard it for him. In the days that followed, the silence between Maya and Bryce was no longer the invisible lull of two distant worlds, but it turned into a taut line between two opposing poles, one side fueled by the classic power of fear, and the other by a newly risen force, calm and unyielding. Bryce could feel it every time he walked through the hallways. Every time eyes glanced at him, no longer expecting anything glamorous, but simply watching, to see how far he would fall. The suffocating weight of his own existence made him uneasy. Bryce was no longer the center of conversations. The jokes that once made others burst into laughter now only received shrugs and impatient glances. He walked past old friend groups, tried to strike up conversations, but felt they spoke with an energy he couldn't infiltrate. A subtle shift in the crowd's energy, and he was being pushed to the edges without any way to stop it. He knew where the problem lay. He wasn't stupid. Maya wasn't just the daughter of the governor. She was a symbol of something the students at Clearview had never had. The strength to stand tall without weapons, without a crowd, without status. She existed like a quiet antibody in a toxic system that Bryce had nurtured for 3 years. And now, every action of his was a living testament to his own decay, He couldn't take it anymore. That afternoon, when the bell rang, signaling the end of classes, Bryce didn't leave the football field like usual. Instead of gathering with his friends in the parking lot or hanging out in the afternoon cafeteria, he stood leaning against the railing of the second floor, his eyes scanning the hallway where Maya usually passed on her way to the parking lot. Soon enough, the familiar figure appeared. She still walked with the same casual stride, hair tied neatly, hands in her coat pockets, as if nothing in the world could make her worry. Maya approached, her eyes brushing over him as if she had predicted this moment would come. "Do you need something?" she asked, her voice neither cold nor high-pitched, but carrying a weight that couldn't be ignored. Bryce inhaled deeply, his chest rising and falling as if he was debating between keeping his pride or admitting defeat. "Why don't you resist?" he asked, each word heavy with torment, as if the question itself was a wound to his own self-esteem. Maya looked at him, her eyes seeming to pierce through his arrogant facade and reach the trembling, vulnerable part inside. She didn't answer right away. She let the question linger in the air for a long moment, as if seeing if Bryce still had the patience to endure his own confusion. Then she spoke, slowly and clearly. "Because I don't need to. You're destroying your own image without me having to do anything." Bryce furrowed his brows. He was about to argue, but his throat tightened, as though her words had stopped every justification in its tracks. Maya didn't stop there. She took a step forward, closing the distance between them until there was barely a single step separating them. "You're not afraid of me. You're afraid of what I represent. You're afraid that others will see you're nothing, without the laughter of approval behind you. You're afraid of the day you walk through the halls and no one looks up. You're afraid of being forgotten, afraid that one day no one will fear you anymore." Bryce stood still. His shoulders twitched slightly. His eyes widened, as if for the first time in his life, someone had seen what even he was too scared to name. "The truth is," Maya continued, her voice low but certain, "you've lived by feeding off the fears of others. You don't need to be a good person. You just need to be tough enough for others not to dare challenge you. But that kind of power, Bryce, it's not lasting. It's as fragile as it is pitiful." He took a step back. Not because he was pushed, but because his instincts urged him to escape her gaze. A gaze that neither hated nor despised, but simply saw him clearly, saw through him. "You think you understand me, huh?" Bryce growled. But the tone in his voice cracked, no longer as confident as before. "You don't know anything about me." "Maybe," Maya nodded. "I don't know who you were. But I know exactly who you're becoming. Someone who's losing control. And you know it too." In that moment, Bryce felt frozen. He felt as if he was standing bare under the midday sun, with no shell left to hide behind. His old friends were slipping away. His reputation was crumbling piece by piece. The petty tricks no longer made an impact. And the worst part was, he wasn't sure who he was anymore if he no longer had fear to exploit from others. Maya didn't need to say anything more. She turned and walked away, leaving Bryce standing motionless in the empty hallway. And for the first time since this game began, Bryce had no words to reply with. No punch, no laughter, no sarcastic remark, just silence and the truth. Bryce stood motionless for a long time after Maya turned and walked away. The hallway was now emptier. The fading sunlight stretched long across the pale tile floor, casting his shadow in a distorted, elongated shape. Inside, he felt a strange, nameless emotion. Not quite anger, not entirely hurt. It was a kind of emptiness, as if someone had drained all the energy from him, leaving a terrifying void behind. For the first time in his life, he didn't know what to say, not because he was speechless, but because it seemed like nothing he could say would matter anymore. The next morning, he woke with a vague sense of determination, determined to prove that Maya was wrong. He would regain control, win back the admiration of the crowd, and make her understand that no matter how smart or determined she was, he was still the one in power. Still the center, the very core of the system she was trying to overthrow. Bryce walked into school with his chest puffed out, chin high, a smile that twisted into a fake grin. But behind those eyes, a sense of confusion could not be hidden. The opportunity came when he entered the cafeteria at lunchtime. The room was packed with students, the clatter of trays on tables, the clinking of cutlery, and the loud chatter formed the usual chaotic soundscape of every high school lunch. Maya had already seated herself at her usual table, a corner by the wall near the window, far enough to avoid being bothered, yet close enough for anyone to see her. She was engrossed in her book, gently stirring her juice, her calm demeanor almost unreal. Bryce scanned the room. His old friends were still at their table, but they didn't seem as eager as before. Ryan sat farther away than usual, his eyes darting around the cafeteria, seemingly trying to avoid Bryce's gaze. A few girls who used to laugh hysterically at every one of his jokes now whispered to each other, occasionally glancing at Maya with looks of curiosity and admiration. He clenched his fists and walked straight to the middle of the cafeteria before turning toward Maya's table. His voice rang out clearly, deliberately raised above the noise around them to drown out the clamor. "Hey, Maya, don't you feel lonely, sitting there all by yourself? Or are you just waiting for your dad to come pick you up so you can feel important?" A few half-hearted chuckles echoed around the room, not in unison, not as enthusiastic as before. Several surprised glances were cast his way. Some students stopped eating. A few froze with their spoons midair. Maya lifted her gaze slowly, setting her spoon down, her eyes slowly turning toward Bryce. Her expression remained unchanged, the same deep, composed look, as though she had been preparing for this moment all along. Bryce pressed on, trying to recreate the mockery he had so often used in the past. "You walk around with that 'I'm more important than all of you' attitude just because your dad's the governor? Do you think that makes everyone bow down to you? Trust me, no one in this school cares." Maya didn't answer right away. She looked at him for a long time, her eyes still and calm, like the surface of a winter lake. Not cold enough to freeze, but not warm enough to allow anyone to stir it. Then, in a moment where the whole room seemed to quiet, she slowly stood up. The way she moved, graceful, purposeful, pulled everyone's attention. Maya took her glass of juice in hand and walked slowly to the center of the cafeteria, stopping directly in front of Bryce. They were barely 3 steps apart, and the crowd began to gather, silent, watching, waiting. Maya looked directly into his eyes, her voice clear but not loud, each word falling with a finality that cut through the air. "You keep talking about my father as though that makes me stronger. But the truth is," she tilted her head slightly, the corner of her mouth lifting in a faint smile, "you were the one who almost wet his pants when you saw him step out of the car." The cafeteria fell silent. No laughter, no sounds of surprise. Even the clink of a dropped spoon echoed loudly, like a bell tolling in an empty church. Bryce froze. His eyes widened, his lips quivered. In that instant, the mask that had kept him at the top, the mask of the ruler, the arrogance, the fake authority, shattered in front of everyone, Not with a punch, not with a shout, but with a single sentence that struck directly at his deepest fear. Maya stood there, her gaze never leaving him. She leaned slightly toward him, as though to whisper, but just loud enough for those nearby to hear. "I don't need to prove anything to you, Bryce. I didn't come here to make people fear me. I just need them to see you a little clearer every day, and believe me, they are." She turned and walked away, each step slow and deliberate, like the beat of a drum in a funeral procession, but not for a person. It was a funeral for a reputation that had been built on fear. Bryce stood there, his shoulders sagging as though weighed down by a burden he no longer had the strength to carry. He could feel the eyes of the whole cafeteria on him, but no one moved, no one reached out. Because he was no longer the center, he was just a part of a past being left behind. And Maya, without her father's power, without the crowd, had rewritten the order with intellect, with poise, with a calm, prideful coldness. She didn't take the throne. She made people realize that the one sitting there never deserved it. When Maya turned her back and walked away from the cafeteria that afternoon, the door behind her closed gently, like the final punctuation of an era. No one said anything. No one stopped her. No one chased after Bryce to pat him on the back or defend him. There were no applause, no chants of anyone's name. But what happened that day, that brief moment when she simply stood in the cafeteria, gazing at Bryce with a calm look and uttering a sentence that pierced the very core of his being, completely changed the game. The next morning, in the mild chill of a late autumn morning, Clearview High opened its doors to students like any other day. But within it, everything had shifted. Bryce Carter walked through the gates, wearing the Letterman jacket emblazoned with his team's name, the one that had once made him stand out in the crowd like a symbol. But today, no one looked up. Not a single eye awaited him. The polite nods had disappeared, replaced by quiet, deliberate avoidance. The bright smiles that had once been directed at him were gone, replaced only by brief glances that skimmed past him, as if no one wanted to look too long at something that was falling apart. Even Ryan, the big friend who had once been ready to throw objects, kick feet, and elbow his way through crowds to protect Bryce's reputation, now walked a step ahead, no longer sitting next to him in class, and not even waiting for him after school. The others, his teammates, the familiar faces from the lavish parties he had once thrown, now only exchanged fleeting glances with him before quickly turning away. The way they left him wasn't out of fear or hatred. It was because they no longer saw anything in him worthy of respect. That was the harshest form of isolation, not being punished by those in power, but having the crowd withdraw their trust, that invisible asset that grants power to the one on top. Bryce felt it in every step, every pause when walking down the hall where no one moved aside for him. Every awkward glance when he cracked a joke, but no one laughed. The power that had once allowed him to manipulate everything in the school, teachers, students, friends, was now slipping away from him bit by bit like a tide receding from a stranded ship. Whispers began to rise, quietly but sharply. Some students retold the event in the cafeteria, each retelling making Maya appear stronger, more resolute, while Bryce shrank, hesitating, gasping for air. Some spoke of past bullying incidents they had once been too afraid to mention, as if Maya's stand had opened the door to a wave of public confessions of things that had once been hidden. And then those whispers spread, like an underground fire in a forest that seemed lush and green. No one could douse it. No one could control it. Because it was no longer about one person. It was the collapse of a misplaced belief that had been held too long. Meanwhile, Maya continued walking through it all. She didn't need to smirk, didn't need to say anything else to fan the flames. She didn't need to shout that she was right. She didn't need to take to social media to complain or expose anyone. Her composure, her quiet pride, waiting for no one's approval, was exactly what made everything around her shift toward her. In class, the teacher began to call on Maya more often, not because her father was the governor, but because of her sharp answers, her logical arguments, her essays that were not only correct but insightful. In the sociology club, she was invited to participate in the first student roundtable at the school. On the campus, underclassmen started to approach her, asking for advice, or simply wanting to get to know her. She didn't change her style of dress, didn't alter her walk, didn't try to be more friendly, but her allure came from her lack of effort. That attraction spread stronger than any fake glow that Bryce had ever flaunted. And that was the hardest blow to Bryce. He found himself shrinking every day, not because of anything Maya did, but because he couldn't stop her growth. He had once thought that reputation was an armor, but now he understood how fragile it was when no one believed in the person wearing it. He had once thought the crowd needed him to exist, but it turned out he was the one who needed the crowd to be recognized, and when that recognition vanished, he was left with only himself, naked, alone, and weak to the point of pitifulness. Bryce walked into the locker room after gym class, and the chatter stopped as soon as he passed. No one tossed a ball to tease him. No one told jokes. No one invited him to parties like they used to. He sat down on the bench, head bowed, hands clenched, not knowing what he was gripping. Anger, hurt, or simply helplessness. Everything that had made Bryce Carter who he was slowly disappearing. No one had to break it. No one had to expose it, because he was destroying himself, bit by bit, day by day, with the way he behaved, with the way he clung to a position that no longer belonged to him. And Maya, without ever striking a blow, was the one who made it all happen. Because in battles of reputation, the winner doesn't need to shout. They only need to let their enemy reveal their true nature before they impale themselves on the false reputation they once thought would last forever. That morning, the atmosphere in the courtyard of Clear View High felt different. A sort of uneasy, quiet tension, as though the whole school was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. The sun had just risen, its light shimmering through the trees, but the students had already gathered in unusual groups by the row of lockers in the main hallway. Murmurs buzzed through the air, eyes wide, phones raised in rapid succession. The air was thick like before a storm. No one spoke loudly, but everyone's attention was focused in the same direction. Bryce entered the courtyard, carrying himself as usual. One strap of his backpack slung over his shoulder, a hoodie casually draped over his arm, his expression trying hard to look indifferent. But as he turned toward his locker, the murmurs erupted. Students who had once avoided him now dared to look him in the eye, no longer with fear or panic, but with a mixture of astonishment, disappointment, and contempt. He stopped, furrowing his brows, feeling an inexplicable tightening in his chest. Something was wrong. Then he saw it. His locker, the old gray steel door that used to slam proudly every day, was now covered in white sheets of paper. Not just a few, but dozens of them. Each page was a screenshot, clearly printed with every text, every conversation, every cruel word Bryce had sent over the past months. The messages weren't anonymous. They all had his personal account name. Crude, mocking, discriminatory, and heartlessly insulting those he had once acted friendly toward. There were texts mocking the appearance of a former close friend, jabs at a black teacher he'd called the speaker from the last century, and worse, harsh words aimed at a transgender student laced with scorn and disdain. What silenced the crowd wasn't the content. They were high school students who didn't exactly shy away from talking behind others' backs. It was the timeline. Each photo was time-stamped. Not from 2 years ago, not some careless words from a naive youth. These were messages from last month, last week, and some as recent as 3 days ago. All of them clearly showed the recipients, the context, and even conversations with some of the very people standing in the courtyard right then. There was no denying it, no blaming the past or misunderstandings. Bryce froze, his feet stuck to the cold tile floor. A chill ran down his spine and lodged itself in his throat, making it impossible to utter a word. For a brief moment, a very brief moment, as everyone stared at him. Not with curiosity or fear, but with a quiet disappointment Bryce had never had to face before. He was no longer the victim of a misunderstanding. He was the truth being exposed. Then, suddenly, as if awakened from a nightmare, Bryce rushed to his locker, tearing the papers off with trembling hands. Each sheet ripped away from the steel like a hopeless scream. He yelled, first a hoarse "no," followed by disjointed, incoherent cries. "This is fake. They're doctored. It's not me. Who the hell did this?" But no one answered. Because they had seen it, they had read it, and most importantly, they had recognized it as the truth. Too clear, too detailed, too real. His voice cracked like a bowstring snapping without an arrow. He kept tearing the papers down, still shouting, but the crowd just backed away, eyes wide, mouths closed like silent masks. A few students still held their phones, recording, no longer afraid of his glare or threats. No one stopped him. No one defended him. No one rushed to pull him from the hallway. He stood alone in the storm he had created. The principal was called. The hall monitors arrived. But even when the teachers asked the students to disperse, the atmosphere remained heavy. No one cared to hear any explanation. No one wanted to know what he would say, because no matter what he said, those words on the papers, printed clearly, without edits, without hesitation, had already said it all. Bryce was escorted out, not surrounded by the proud crowd of a champion, but between two hall monitors, their eyes heavy with contempt and cold silence. Each step he took dragged like a sentence. No one cried, no one stopped him, no friends followed, no one sought justice for him. Right there, in that hallway, the name Bryce Carter, the once unshakable icon in Clearview High's social life, officially crumbled. Not by blood, not by a punch, not through an official accusation from the school, but by the truth, bare, unforgiving. And somewhere at the end of the hallway, where the clear glass reflected the early light, Maya Williams stood by the classroom window, quietly watching. She didn't smile. She didn't show satisfaction. But in the way she tilted her head slightly, set her pen down, and returned to her work, it was clear she had known this was coming all along. Because some people don't need to attack to win. They just wait and let the truth do what justice often misses. In the midst of the hallway, filled with the frantic sound of paper tearing and Bryce's uneven, gasping breaths, Maya stood still, neither advancing nor retreating, not getting involved in the crowd. She simply crossed her arms, lightly leaning against the opposite cabinet, her posture graceful, as if detached from the chaos before her. Her gaze was still, like a calm lake, yet not indifferent. It was the look of someone who had already seen what was to come, and when it arrived, there was no need to shout for acknowledgement. She didn't wear a victorious expression, didn't sneer, nor show any smug satisfaction. She simply observed, like a judge who doesn't need a gavel, only the truth stepping onto the witness stand. And it was that quiet composure amidst the stunned stares and the flashing phones that made her the true center of attention. You don't have to be the loudest to be noticed. Maya proved that the one who controls the silence holds the real power. After tearing through nearly all the papers on the cabinet, Bryce turned around, his eyes bloodshot from anger and fear. Sweat poured from his temples, his breath rapid as if he were fleeing from something he couldn't explain. When he saw Maya standing there, it was as if he had been stabbed in the chest. Not by a sharp blade, but by a gaze that neither condemned nor redeemed him. She wasn't there to destroy him. She was simply waiting for him to destroy himself. In his frenzy, Bryce screamed, "You did this! It's you!" The scream echoed down the hallway, a final attempt to hold on to the image of the victim, hoping that if he shouted loud enough, if he was desperate enough, someone would believe him, someone would pity him, someone would return to his side. But this time, no one spoke in support. The friends who had stood by him at every party, who had hidden his cruel words, who had cheered when he bullied someone. Now they all stepped back, their gazes avoiding him as if he were something to be avoided, not saved. Maya tilted her head slightly, removed her hand from her chest, and walked toward him. Not quickly, not aggressively, but with the step of someone who controls the game in a chess match where the opponent is confused because they no longer have a move. She stopped in front of him, her eyes meeting his directly, her voice calm as always, neither loud nor angry, but carrying an invisible force that made the surrounding space feel smaller, urging everyone to listen. "I didn't need to do this, I just helped everyone see who you really are." Bryce opened his mouth, as if to say something, but then closed it again. No words could refute her statement. No excuse strong enough to erase the evidence that was being shared across the school's phones. He had been exposed, not because Maya set a trap, but because he had lived too long in the facade of a false image, forgetting that the truth could come from anyone. He had said those words, he had sent those messages, and now everyone could see. Behind Maya, the students had gathered in larger numbers, but no one was laughing. There were no cheers or boos. The silence was overwhelming, but not apathetic. It was the silence of awareness, of a shift in collective thinking. They looked at Bryce as if he were a fallen statue, not brought down by an outside force, but because the very foundation inside had long since decayed. Bryce took a step back, then another. It was as if he were searching for a door, some escape from the gaze of everyone. But the school, once his stage, had now become a courtroom. Every gaze was a verdict. Every phone raised was evidence capturing the moment of his collapse. And Maya, still standing in the midst of it all, was the one who didn't need to deliver a judgment, for the collapse had already spoken for her. The principal appeared, accompanied by a supervisor and several teachers who rushed to prevent Bryce from further destruction. But it was already too late. Not because the papers had been posted, but because the image of him in the students' minds had shattered. Some turned away, not wanting to look anymore. Others stayed, not to witness Bryce Carter's downfall, but to remember that there are those who were once very strong. But if that strength doesn't come from integrity, it will eventually be exposed. Bryce was taken away, this time by the decision of the administration. His face was pale, his eyes dazed. His protests were now nothing more than weak whispers. He no longer screamed. He knew, even if he did, no one would listen. Maya didn't follow. She turned and walked back to class, not in a hurry. Her walk, as always, unchanged. But anyone who looked could understand that she was no longer the quiet new student. She was no longer an outsider. She had become a symbol, not of power from parental authority, but of integrity, of the courage to face, and of the patience to wait for the truth to speak for itself. She didn't need to shout. She just needed to stand there among the crowd like a silent judge, and that was enough. When Bryce Carter was taken away from the hallway, his eyes met with stares and blank sheets of paper that revealed the whole truth. Maya didn't look back. She continued walking toward her class, passing through the corridors that once belonged to the king of the school, a name still spoken with admiration, caution, and sometimes fear. But today, every corner led to one singular image: the undeniable collapse of a self too large to understand limits, too arrogant to see it was being replaced by the very things he once scorned: composure, intellect, and integrity that didn't need embellishment. The class continued, but the atmosphere in the school had changed. Every time someone looked at the whiteboard or down at their exercise book, their gaze unconsciously drifted to the empty seat where Bryce used to sit, leaning back confidently, gesturing as if every answer belonged to him. Now, the seat was vacant, silent, and cold. A spot that once represented power now remained as a mark of something past. No one said much, but within each student something was shifting. The respect that had once been given to Bryce seemed to turn into long-suppressed discontent, now allowed to breathe. And like all endings, when the wall fell, people no longer remembered how it once stood tall. They only thought of the cracks and the damage it caused when it was still worshipped. At the end of the lesson, Maya didn't stay to chat, didn't celebrate, didn't accept any compliments. She quietly packed her books and walked out of the class as usual. But today, each step she took seemed to be carpeted with looks of respect from those who once thought she wouldn't last a week in this school. No one stopped her, no one crowded to ask questions. They just watched quietly, like one watches a rare thing passing through their life. Fairness, truth, and courage without noise. As Maya pushed open the door to the schoolyard, the late afternoon sun bathed the old bricks in golden light. The breeze brushed through the trees, carrying the scent of dry sunshine and fresh printed paper, the smell of change. And at the far end of the parking lot, the familiar SUV was parked silently like a loyal witness to every rise and fall of the daughter it picked up every day. Franklin Williams, governor of Texas, still sat behind the wheel, his white shirt sleeves rolled up, a stern face and watchful eyes. But today, as Maya approached, he didn't need to ask anything. He simply opened the car door from the inside, allowing her to enter. A silent acknowledgement that the daughter he once taught about integrity, patience, and the strength of silence had understood all of it, and used it as a sharper blade than anything he ever taught. Maya sat down beside him, buckled her seatbelt, and leaned her head back slightly. A few seconds passed in silence. There was no hurried engine roar, no anxious questions from the powerful father. Just quiet, like a deep, complete exhale after a long journey. Then she spoke softly, enough for him to hear, but without raising her voice. "He's destroyed himself." Franklin turned to look at his daughter, the corners of his mouth turning into a subtle, somber smile. It wasn't the smile of a victor, but of someone who understood. Sometimes victory doesn't come from defeating someone, but from making them face themselves, the darkness they've hidden for too long. He placed his hand on the wheel, started the car. The engine hummed deeply and warmly, like the heartbeat of someone who had weathered a storm. The SUV rolled out of the school grounds, leaving behind a fallen empire and a girl who had risen as a new symbol, not by the power of her father, but by her own dignity. Meanwhile, Bryce Carter had exited the school through the back door, escorted by the dean and principal. No flashlights, no friends bidding farewell, no voices in his defense. He walked through the gates like a lost soul, hunched, head down, his long shadow under the late sunlight as if it were trying to melt into the earth. And when the gate closed behind him, all that had once been his glory, the laughter, the cheers, the praise, faded like a page being turned to its final chapter. No one called him the king of the school anymore. No one remembered him as a symbol of power. All that remained was the memory of someone who had built his own temple, only to tear it down with his own hands when no one was left to worship. And Maya, the girl once seen as a mere shadow, had proven that you didn't need to shout to be heard. You didn't need to fight to reclaim fairness. She only needed to stand firm and let those who wore masks retreat from the stage. In silence, she had done what the entire school had once thought impossible. And in the fading sunlight, all that remained was the sound of the car rolling away, the wind sweeping through the trees, and a new page silently turning. The sleek black SUV drove away from the Clearview High campus, carrying the Williams father and daughter as they glided through the familiar streets of Houston, bathed in the late afternoon sunlight. The breeze outside slipped through the crack in the window, brushing through Maya's hair, causing a few strands to flutter lightly before her forehead. She remained silent, gazing out the window as though allowing her mind to settle after the storm that had passed. A storm she had not fought with strength, nor avoided with fear, but instead had navigated like a steady helmsman in the midst of a tempest. Franklin Williams glanced at his daughter but said nothing. He understood that look. He understood that silence. And he knew that some victories don't require celebrations, don't need banners raised high. They simply need a nod between father and daughter, a wordless acknowledgement. Maya smiled faintly, without looking at him, and quietly uttered a sentence, as if to close the chapter of everything that had happened. Now I can finally live like a normal student. Franklin raised an eyebrow, then chuckled softly. The deep laugh of someone who has climbed many peaks and learned that sometimes the ordinary is the most precious. He didn't reply, simply easing off the gas, allowing the car to glide smoothly, as though time itself had just passed through a heavy chapter. Maya didn't need the protection of political power. She hadn't chosen the title of governor's daughter to reclaim her place, to oppress her enemies, or to make anyone bow down. What she chose was the silence at the right moment, the clever reply rather than a loud retort, the strength of someone who knew her worth and understood that truth held more power than any symbol worn on the outside. At Clearview High, things gradually returned to their orbit after the collapse known as Bryce Carter. The papers once posted on his locker were taken down, but their contents lingered in the memories of the students, like an unnamed lesson, heavy with meaning. The classrooms, the sports fields, the cafeteria, all were missing a character that once made them chaotic. Yet strangely, this absence didn't create a void. On the contrary, it opened up space for something healthier to take root. Maya was no longer the girl who quietly walked the halls with averted eyes. She still didn't seek fame, still sat at her usual table in the cafeteria, still carried a book in her hand, and wore a soft yet proud smile at the corner of her lips. However, now, when she walked down the hallway, people no longer looked with curiosity, but with respect. Teachers spoke of her as an example of strength and character. The students, who had once been bullied by Bryce, sought her out to talk, sharing their stories, and for the first time they felt truly heard without being judged. What was special was that Maya didn't need to change to receive this. She remained true to herself, from her steady tone of voice, her straight posture, to her gaze, always looking forward. But what made her stand out wasn't her appearance or her title, but the way she firmly held on to her dignity amidst the temptations of power, anger, and retaliation. Bryce Carter had vanished from the school like a crumbled monument that no one mourned. People didn't speak of him as an evil person, but as a lesson, a warning, a sign that power built on fear would never last. It only endured as long as the crowd believed itself to be weak. And when courage arose, even if only from one person, that entire system would crack. Maya understood that, and she never wanted revenge. She just wanted the truth to be seen. She didn't need anyone to regret their actions. She just needed everyone to know that kindness did not equal weakness. Silence did not mean submission. And those sitting on their thrones trembled most when they feared the truth. A week after the incident, Maya was invited to speak at the student council meeting on the topic of power and responsibility in the school environment. She stepped up to the small stage in the main auditorium, without notes, without a rehearsed speech. She simply looked straight at the row of students who sat in silence, and began with a simple sentence. We don't need anyone else to give us power to be ourselves. The only thing we need is the courage to stand for what's right, even when it makes us different. In that moment, every gaze was fixed on her, not because of her title as governor's daughter, but because of the truth in every word. She wasn't preaching. She was speaking from experience, from the heart, from the silence that had once been suppressed and turned into strength. And that was the moment Maya Williams was no longer a nameless student in the transfer list, no longer an easy target in a harsh environment. She became the person that others silently looked up to, not because she raised her voice, but because she proved a seemingly small thing, that even in places where it seemed impossible, kindness and strength could still triumph. In some corner of the school, where the wind blew through the old oak trees, the bell signaling the end of school rang, clear, long, and full of hope. A new era had begun, and Maya, with all her calmness and intellect, was the one who laid the first brick for the foundation of a Clearview High no longer built on fear, but on respect and courage. And that is the story of Maya Williams, the girl who quietly walked into Clearview High as an outsider, but left it as a symbol of strength, intellect, and determination. Without the power of her father, without retaliation through fists, Maya taught the entire school, and Bryce Carter, a lesson. That power built on fear is the most fragile power of all, while strength derived from truth and integrity is unshakable. This story makes us ask ourselves, if you were in her shoes, would you choose to face it like Maya, with calmness and intelligence, or take the path of immediate retaliation? Share your thoughts in the comments. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on the next videos. See you in the next inspiring stories.